Hello, comrades, and welcome to the Revolution Report. My name is Don. I'm the host. If you're the first time watching this right now, and I'm really happy to be joined by Dan Kovalik. He's a wonderful friend of mine. He was just recently in Moscow. Very, very smart lad, and also he was an election observer in Kherson. So we wanted to talk about today the Russian elections. There's a lot of things that we can talk about in connection to it because, like I said, Dan observed the elections specifically in Kherson, one of the newly integrated territories into the Russian Federation. I was at the Communist Party headquarters, and there were a lot of attempts by the West to meddle in these elections, both, in terms of things over the internet, cyber attacks, as well as physical attacks by Ukrainian troops. So we wanted to discuss that a bit, have a discussion here, and have a nice conversation that you guys can all enjoy and take something away from. So, Dan, like I said, thanks a lot for coming on to the Revolution Report. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience in Kherson as an election observer? Like, what did you see there? What are some of the moments that you found interesting, and also just kind of like about the general situation there? Obviously, I think that'd be interesting for people to hear about.
Yeah, well, it was very interesting. We were in what is the new capital of the oblast, because the old capital, Kherson City, is in Ukrainian control. People may remember or not that Russia took control of all of Kherson, including the capital, the Kherson City, which is on the other side of the Dnieper River, but then had a tactical retreat from there. Mm-hmm. So they don't control that anymore. So they've moved the current capital to a city southeast of that. And it was a very festive atmosphere. The first polling place we went to was the main polling place in the square, and there was actually a band playing in front of the polling place, and people were lined up. The poll opened at 8, but people had already lined up by 7 to vote, and people seemed very excited, and they had held a festival in front of the polling place for the whole weekend, and there was local foods which we partook of, including some delicious borscht, mm-hmm. amongst other things. So that was the most dramatic and interesting, was being there. But then we also went to some more far-flung places. I mean, the region's very big, so it's very rural as well. You can drive for hours without seeing anything but farmland. Mm-hmm. And we actually went to a farm. We had a breakfast there, and they raised goats, and they had a lot of goats we saw. They gave us some local goat cheeses that they make. It was nice to have those little experiences and to talk to people. I mean, the people we talked to said that, the infrastructure's really improved since Russia's taken over, that Ukraine really never did anything for them. Mm-hmm. In terms of even paving the roads. And in fact, a lot of the roads still aren't paved. I mean, we were driving on muddy roads for a while, but Russia's starting to improve those things. And I think people don't realize that the so-called new regions, which are really also old regions because they were part of Russia going back to Catherine the Great,
yeah.
They were neglected by Kiev. Kiev viewed the east of their country as a backwater, because they're Russian-speaking people, and they really didn't do anything for those people. Similarly with Crimea, which I visited in May, they didn't do much for Crimea either. So they talk about wanting those territories back, but they've never really tried to win over the hearts and minds of those people. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, of course, people complained about, because I asked people, I tried to really ask pointed questions so I could explain things to people back in the States. And I was at a big meeting on the second day of the elections. We were there. And it was mostly with the organizers of local election observers from the region, and also some of the observers, mostly youth observers. And I said, well, we're being told in the West that Russia, big bad Russia, invaded these regions, and the people don't want to go to Russia, and this is interfering in Ukrainian sovereignty. What do you say to that? And a few of the people, they were very emotional about it. And their main point was, look, after the coup in 2014, the Maidan coup, they started discriminating against Russian speaking people and outlawing the Russian language and Russian culture. And we didn't want to be part of that. So the two republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, they voted early on in 2014 to become sovereign republics because of that. Crimea at that time voted to go with Russia. But other republics like Kherson, which didn't do as dramatic of things, a lot of the people felt the very same way. So a lot of them are very relieved to be part of Russia, and you could see that. And especially the older people, you saw a lot of babushkas voting, and you can imagine they were voting back in the Soviet days, right? They were a lot of these people were used to voting for their leaders in Moscow. This is not, the West tries to pretend that this was always part of Ukraine, and they pretend that the breakup of the Soviet Union was a good thing. It was democratic when it was far from it.
Yeah.
Which, if you don't mind me kind of segueing into that for a minute, because I think there's something important to impress upon people in terms of that. So when the Soviet Union existed, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So all these regions, but also Kiev and the west of Ukraine and Crimea, all were part of the Soviet Union. And early in 1991, there was a referendum held throughout the Soviet Union on whether the Soviet Union should continue. And 78% of the voters throughout all the areas voted to continue the Soviet Union. They wanted the Soviet Union continue.
Yeah.
And then later in the year, 3 drunk guys, including Yeltsin from the Russian Federation, and the head of the Ukrainian Federation at the time, and the head of the Belarus Federation, or republics at that time, republics that were part of the Soviet Union. I'm forgetting their names now. They met in the woods, got drunk, and they decided to disband the Soviet Union. That was totally undemocratic. It was against the will of the people. And not only was the breakup undemocratic, the very fact they broke it up, but how it was divided was undemocratic.
Yeah.
So, for example, earlier in the year also, in 1991, the people of Crimea had their own referendum that everyone respected, including Ukraine, in which Crimea voted to become its own separate republic away from Ukraine, because it was part of Ukraine at that time, part of that republic, as of 1954, when Khrushchev just arbitrarily gifted Crimea to Ukraine. But at that time, it didn't matter because they were still in the Soviet Union, so it was just kind of symbolic. But the people of Crimea saw that the possibility of the Soviet Union falling apart was becoming real. They did not want to be part of Ukraine if that happened, so they voted to go independent. People don't know that, right? So, but when the 3 leaders of those republics, again, on their own, secretly decided to break up the Soviet Union, they kept Crimea as part of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Even though they knew the Crimeans didn't want that, but they didn't care. And they also didn't take into account that the people, certainly of the Donbass, wouldn't have wanted that. That they wouldn't want to be part of Ukraine. They would have wanted to go back to Russia. All that was undemocratic and illegal. The Chinese made this point at the UN fairly recently. I don't know if you recall that or saw that. The Chinese said the breakup of the Soviet Union was not legal.
Yeah.
If we're going to talk about sovereignty and legal borders and all, these borders that exist as of, let's just say, February of 2022, when the special military operations began, those were not legal to begin with. We are still fighting over the legacy of the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It was a very traumatic event in which the West, encouraged and engaged in many acts, provocative acts, including the war in Afghanistan, to quicken the death of the Soviet Union. And they didn't give a damn what the people of the Soviet Union wanted. And now those things are continuing to be worked out in a very painful, violent way, as these things tend to be.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing are continuing to fight is World War II. And that's the other thing people need to recognize. The fight against fascism continues. And the people, again, particularly in the Donbass, and I've been to Donetsk twice since the special military operations began. And the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, collectively the Donbass, are very, very painfully aware of the history of fascism, of Nazism. In Donetsk, the Nazis occupied Donetsk during the war. They actually made one of the second largest mass graves in the world in Donetsk. 75,000 bodies they threw into there, the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
Some people alive when they did it, and there's a memorial to that. And the people of Donetsk are very aware of that history, and they feel like that's repeating now, and that they're fighting fascism now. And again, so all these things, and again, the West is part of that. The West exploited divisions in Ukraine for decades to try to undermine the Soviet Union. The U.S. supported Nazis in Ukraine to try to undermine the Soviet Union, and kept Nazism alive in Ukraine for the purpose of undermining Russia. And so we continue to fight World War II because it never really ended, because the West never ended it. As some people say, the U.S. didn't defeat the Nazis, they absorbed them.
Yeah.
And that's true. And in the end, let's face it, it wasn't the U.S. that defeated them anyway. It was the Soviet Union.
Right.
Which that history is being denied as well, because it's, again, a very inconvenient history. So anyway, I've gone on too long, I'm sure. But all those things have to be kept in mind when we talk about this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about those complexities, what it comes down to is it's between the brothers here. It's between these peoples in Russia and Ukraine and all the other former republics. They have to work this out themselves. And it could have been worked out in a much more peaceful way. Even after the special military operations began, there was an agreement apparently reached in principle in March of 2022, which would have allowed Ukraine to keep all their territory. And the U.S. and U.K. intervened to kill that peace deal.
Yeah.
It could have been resolved in a much more peaceful way. But the West didn't want that. The West wanted this war.
Yeah.
And they still want this war. And they want it for the same reason they wanted the Nazis to invade the Soviet Union, because they want to weaken Russia, if not totally destroy it.
Yeah.
So when you realize those things, the main takeaway has to be that the West needs to should never have backed this war, and should end their backing of it. And we in the West need to call on the West to stop, particularly the United States, to stop funding a war which is doing nothing but sending young Ukrainian men to the meat grinder. They're not going to win this. And the territory they could have had back in 2022, they ain't getting back now. Ukraine is not going to be the country it was, and that's the West's fault. They could have had that. Though I don't even think that's necessarily desirable. But again, that's not up to me. That's up to them to figure out. But I do think that the people of these four regions, by and large, will be happier with Russia. I do think that. And certainly the Crimeans are much happier with Russia. being part of Russia. I mean, if you go to Crimea, if you can get there, it's a beautiful, beautiful peninsula, very gorgeous.
Yeah, actually, I've been there many times. I wanted to say, yeah, the points you made about the Soviet Union are really important because, you know, it's one thing to get people to understand that the Ukraine conflict didn't start with Russia's military operation, but with the U.S. Backed coup d'état in 2014. But really, the roots of the whole conflict they stretch farther back into history, which you just explained, right? This illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union. There's even an organization in Russia, actually, that refuses to acknowledge the dissolution of Russia because of the fact that it was illegal, according to international law. And in terms of Crimea, like you said, actually, it's like the same with Kherson and Zaporozhye and Donetsk and Lugansk. They've gotten Crimea has gotten much more developed and beautiful since it became part of Russia. Since people there voted to be part of Russia, because, like you said, was happening in Kherson, the Ukrainians in Crimea really neglected the infrastructure there as well. It's only when they became part of Russia was there like heavy government investment in infrastructure, development of tourism. It was always a center of tourism, but it became very much more so after it became part of Russia. But yeah, like you said, I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union, its illegal dissolution, rather, would be more accurate to say, I think much more a root cause of what's going on right now than even the U.S.-backed coup d'état in 2014, because obviously the U.S. wanted the Soviet Union to collapse so that it could do exactly what it's been doing in Ukraine right now, and the collective West in general, right? Because we saw just complete pillaging of the economy in Russia during the 1990s. We saw Western powers trying to, spark conflicts all over these former republics of the Soviet Union. And like you said, again, this referendum to keep the Soviet Union, overwhelmingly people voted for it. And this is one of the reasons why the Communist Party is still the second most popular political party in Russia. It always comes in second place. Although this time in the presidential elections it got significantly less than it usually does, but still came in second place. The Communist Party is still the second most popular party in Russia because people remember the Soviet Union. And it's funny how the people who remember it are the most supportive of it, because in the West, obviously, they say to people who support communism, they say, oh, you only support communism because you never lived under it. But in Russia, the people who lived under it are the most supportive of communism. And to be honest, the farther you go back in history, like if you talk to people who are still alive who lived under Stalin, they're like the most hardcore communists you're going to talk to. So it makes you really question the narrative that is usually told to us in the West, that Stalin was an evil dictator, everyone hated communism in the Soviet Union. But as the Soviet Union became less and less true to the original Marxist-Leninist ideals, that's only when people living there started to become less and less Marxist-Leninist minded, which is interesting. So it contradicts what people say, in the West about that.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible fact that if you go throughout Russia, it's rare that you'll talk to someone that doesn't like Stalin.
Yeah.
I mean, he's very popular. And the polls show that. The polls show that year after year, it's Stalin and Peter the Great kind of switch off between the number one and number two top leaders of all time.
Yeah.
And what's incredible about that is that while Peter the Great is very much promoted within Russia and within schools and that sort of, and with monuments as a great leader, Stalin is not. He is, despite years of being told how bad Stalin was, despite the fact there's no more monuments left to him, people still love him. I mean, which says a lot, right?
Yeah.
You can't claim that they've been propagandized. In fact, they've been propagandized the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And as you say, the polls show a majority of the people throughout the Soviet Union support the Soviet Union, think they lived better under the Soviet Union, and that's true in the East Bloc too.
Yeah.
At least outside of Poland, which was always a bit of an outlier. But outside of Poland, it's the case that the polls show most people thought they lived better under communism.
Yeah.
And we had a guy in our delegation in Kherson. He's German, but. And I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "I'm from the German Democratic Republic."
What was his name?
German.
What was his name?
God, Wilhelm, I think. I have to go. He's a documentarian. I guess he's a very well-established documentarian. Actually, as we're talking, I can find.
Okay.
I can find his name. But so that was kind of neat.
Yeah, that is cool. We did a video on this channel about the German Democratic Republic, actually, and I found a video of someone who lived in the GDR who gave an interview to Russian television, and he's like, "If it was up to me, I would have built the Berlin Wall twice as high."
Absolutely, and again, the irony in the they complain. The West complained bitterly about that wall. Meanwhile, Israel's walls are much bigger.
I know.
Taller, longer, and they don't care about those.
Yeah, and
the hypocrisy just kills me.
I know,
honestly.
And the GDR wasn't committing genocide. That's another thing.
No.
What?
So, but that's why we have to exist. We have to keep calling this stuff. His name is Wilhelm Schultz.
Ah, okay. I'll have to look him up later. Yeah, he's got to be interesting if he's a documentary filmmaker in Kherson. So.
Yeah, he was great. He was fun.
When you were there, did you experience any like artillery attacks, or were there any attacks while you were there during the elections?
Yeah, so we were the most direct way we were affected by it. We were on our way on Saturday to. That would have been Saturday, March 16th, to a polling place 4 hours away from where we were staying. And then we abruptly stopped for this real long breakfast, even though they got us up at 6 a.m. And then they took us to this farm, and we were all thinking I thought we had somewhere to go. Well, they told us later that they found a mine that was placed.
Wow.
I think under a ballot box at that polling station, so we didn't go there, as it turned out.
Wow.
And then there were at least 2 polling places that were actually successfully attacked in the region nearer to the line of contact, near the Dnieper River there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there were attacks. I mean, it was mostly peaceful, I would say, and it felt peaceful, but there were those attacks that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe we could talk a little bit about, other attacks as well that occurred in other places in Belgorod, because this kind of also falls under the umbrella of election meddling, I think, because a lot of these attempts by Ukrainian militias, specifically into Belgorod and Kursk, all of the Russian border regions, essentially, They happen on the eve of the elections. It's almost like it constituted an attempt to scare people out of voting,
Right.
So, yeah.
What they were.
Yeah.
And, of course, the U.S., they put out travel alerts saying there were going to be terror attacks even in Moscow. This was a concerted effort to try to lower voter turnout. Clearly, the West did not want high voter turnout because they wanted to say it was a sham election. But when 77% of the electorate turns out to vote, it's a little bit hard to claim it's a sham with a straight face.
Right.
Though the West has tried to do that, of course.
Right.
And even in the regions, the voter turnout was rather high, I believe. In Kherson, I think it was certainly well over 50%. I'm not sure what the total was, but
yeah.
So all that shows a certain enthusiasm, obviously, and then of course Putin won with 87% of the vote. I mean, that's an extraordinary showing, and I think all of us who've experienced Russia can say that does reflect where the Russian people are at. I mean,
Definitely.
They support Putin. And let's face it, he's done. Look, he's done an amazing job for that country. I mean, he he will go down as one of the great Russian leaders. You know, when he took over, what was it, 1999? It was after the horrible 90s,
Yeah.
which again, the West glorifies as some democratic blossoming.
Yeah.
In fact, 2 million people died at least prematurely because of the economic dislocation.
Yeah.
In the 90s, crime was rampant. You know, our friend Olga, who we had drinks with, you know what she told me is very profound. She said, Dan, during that time, my biggest fear was being raped.
Yeah.
Because she said women were being raped on the street. She had friends who were just raped by strangers. This was something never happened in Soviet days.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it just, the society, the economy, the society, everything collapsed. Sense of nation collapsed. Gangs were running rampant. And, you know, again, whatever you say about Putin, he turned that situation around. That is not existent anymore.
Yeah.
And the people know it, and they appreciate him. And that's why the West hates him.
Yeah.
They wanted them to stay like that. They wanted Yeltsin, a drunkard at the helm, who would just let them plunder the place at will.
Yeah.
And Putin didn't put up with that, and they hate him for that.
Yeah, and they're also trying to push this. They're also trying to convince people, right, especially in the West, and it's easy to do, that there can't possibly be a leader in power who's like in power for like 20 years and not be a dictator, when that's not true at all, right? I mean, that's completely possible. And I think another example, for example, is like Fidel Castro when he came to power. You know, he was.
Yeah, how about Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
Exactly.
Who was elected 4 times.
Exactly.
Or how about Angela Merkel, I think, was in power nearly 20, if not 20. And there's lots of examples of that throughout the world. And again, they just kind of pick and choose, and they ignore those other examples.
Right.
That so, but yeah, of course that's true, and people should have a right, if they want a leader to be in power more than 2 terms, for example, that should be their right. I mean,
yeah.
Again, the world would be a much better place had Roosevelt served that 4th term.
Exactly.
Truman was a disaster.
A nightmare, yeah. A nightmare.
For everyone. So, anyway, yeah, that's obviously true, and it doesn't make him a dictator at all. He is the people's choice. Again, whether you like him or you don't like him, you have to concede that point. That the people.
Yeah, but I guess it's hard for people to understand when, like, they live in a country that's dominated by the mainstream media, I guess, you know, who's, like, constantly giving attention to, like, super insignificant opposition in Russia, or, like, people who are against the military operation or whatever. Like, when the mainstream media is constantly giving attention to this stuff that's actually insignificant in Russian society, you know, I guess people are going to get the impression that there's a lot of opposition. But actually, what I've noticed is that as living here, I mean, after the military operation and after the West put sanctions on Russia and all the rhetoric that Russia's had to deal with from the West, there's tons of people that I know that used to be like supportive of the opposition. Now they support Putin. And like even tons of people who used to vote for the Communist Party or the Liberal Democratic Party, which is neither liberal nor democratic. It's actually a very hyper-conservative party. A lot of people used to vote for these parties. They ended up voting for Putin in this round of the presidential elections because there's a real air of unity in the country right now. You know, in Russia, there's a real idea that the vast majority of people in Russia, I think, have, where the country's going through, it's essentially being attacked. And, you know, the patriotic thing is to stand behind the guy who's been leading the country through it. He's been leading the country through it well. And, you know, another thing is that Putin's speech around the time of the elections, he didn't make these like crazy promises to the people. He didn't say we're going to be living in luxury and by the time I'm gone. He was like, the country's going through some hard times, but we're going to get through it together. It just goes to show that he's a really pragmatic politician who, is willing to garner that kind of unity and support from the people.
Yeah, and here's a guy who grew up during the siege of Leningrad, right? He's seen the worst. He's seen difficult times, and as you say, he's been able to navigate Russia through those times. And there's a real blossoming there of national patriotism. People, I think, for the first time in a long time, are proud to be Russian.
Yeah.
And for the first time, don't give a damn what the West says about them. They, a lot of their self-esteem came from how much the West liked them.
Yeah.
And now they don't care. They realize the West hates them and will always hate them. And so they've decided to look inward. And that's good for them. That's good for any people. I mean, the United States could use that. I mean, we don't have a sense of national identity. I think, the polls show people are feel very hopeless in this country about where the country's going. They don't see a bright future. I think there isn't a sense of national identity because the only thing the country does is go to war. That's the only goal it seems to have. And that's just not, and they're wars of choice that no one supports.
Yeah.
And, so there's an existential crisis in the United States. In Russia, there's not right now. They're proud of who they are. And that really bothers the West because they're really floundering. They're floundering philosophically and spiritually in a way that Russia is not. And I think they're jealous, in truth. But,
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, like that's even what you said is more of an illustration of how not democratic the United States is actually. Like, even though there's elections, like the elections that are controlled by the corporations, first of all, that fund the campaigns of the candidates. Also, all these wars, like, nobody supports. The Iraq War, everyone knows we got lied into, and the ruling class is like, oh well, sorry. And I saw someone in the chat mentioning like Gen Z and millennials. I think politically the majority of them have just like checked out, because there's not really anything to fight for. It's like people just live either for consumerism or for money. That's basically it.
Yeah, and the military can't even recruit. They have a real recruiting crisis.
Yeah.
Because what are you signing up to fight for? Oil? I mean, that's everyone knows it.
Yeah.
We're not fighting. It's not. We don't fight defensive wars.
Right.
To protect the homeland.
Right. And
that's what Russia's doing.
Yeah.
That's what people support. It's crazy. And right. How's that democratic? How's it democratic that we're spending $1 trillion a year on a military that is fighting wars to benefit the military-industrial complex?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just grotesque.
Yeah. And that's another that ties into something else interesting, right? In Russia, there's conscription, and in America, there's not. Conscription works in Russia because Russia isn't going off fighting aggressive imperialist wars all over the world. I think in the U.S., I mean, obviously, there's still the possibility of conscription, but I think that the U.S. would only use it in the most dire of circumstances because Vietnam proved to the government that, conscripts aren't gonna want to fight these crazy wars that they don't believe in halfway across the planet,
No, absolutely. Well, they got rid of conscription after Vietnam because they saw what happened, that when people were forced to go fight those wars, they took to the streets, and they didn't want that anymore.
Yeah.
They also didn't want to be forcibly recruiting, people from the college who were studying Marxism and stuff, and it would end up shooting their officers, so they ended up abandoning the draft, and now basically there's just economic conscription. People sign up because they're desperate economically.
Yeah.
The totally unfair way,
Yeah.
again, to raise the military, that you just send the poor to fight.
Yeah.
That's what we
A
do.
slave army.
Yeah. And it totally perverts everything. And because those in power, their kids don't have to go to war, they're more easily, convinced to vote in favor of war, because it's not going to be their hide that's at stake, so it's terrible. No, I think there's a progressive case for conscription for that reason. If everyone had an equal chance to serve, you'd have less wars, period.
Yeah.
And that's why they hate it. That's why they hate conscription. They know that.
Yeah. Well, before we end the live stream, I wanted to talk a little bit about a claim that the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service made. They said that there were cyber attacks against the Russian voting system. There was also another member of the State Duma who said that the West spent over $20 billion actually in their attempts to meddle in the Russian presidential elections. What are some things that you heard about that or that you know?
Well, yeah, I heard that there were some successful cyber attacks. Of course, there were these travel alerts the State Department put out saying there's, imminent terrorist attacks against Moscow. And again, you did have these actual attacks funded by the West, of course, against civilian targets in places like Kherson, Belgorod, Kerch you mentioned as well. All those things were designed to interfere with the elections, in a way that even if you accepted the worst claims about Russia in the 2016 elections, Russia's never done anything like that to us,
Right.
It's very shameful, and again, it just shows the lack of confidence the West has anymore. All we can do is try to bully people. We don't have any power of persuasion anymore.
Right. I think it's crazy that, U.S.-backed militants from the Ukrainian military are attacking places on Russian territory, and that's the way the U.S. Meddles in Russia's elections. Meanwhile, the things that the U.S. accused Russia of during the U.S. presidential elections were like some internet trolls that could not even be proven to have been connected to Russia. That's
right.
That's like the craziest
it was nothing.
thing.
It was nothing. Again, the worst allegation. It was, as someone said, it was a scandal without any allegations.
Right.
I mean, it's just silly.
Right. No proof and just tons of accusations. But that's usually how the West does it in regard to Russia. But anyway, Dan, thanks a lot for coming on the Revolution Report. I'm going to end it here. I know you got another interview to go to, but I really appreciate it. I thought the conversation was really interesting. We should have you on again sometime to talk more about communism specifically. Thanks.
Yes, my favorite topic. Excellent.
Yep. All right, comrades. Thanks for joining us on the Revolution Report. Make sure to stay tuned for the next live stream, which will be next week, and Workers of the World, unite.